This account I'll give you might be a little unusual in that it's not often that someone who's had so much time in the Eastern spiritual tradition out of India with thousands of hours of meditation and this sort of thing over a 28-year span and finally landed where I landed, believing what I do. So this is, I'll give you a brief account of what happened. So I was a boarding school brat, 10 years of boarding school. And I can remember that at about the age of 15, my brain woke up and I started to reflect on life, think about things a little more than I previously had. And by the time I got to 18, all my friends knew what they wanted to do. One wanted to become a doctor, one wanted to go on the land, one wanted to go into business. But frankly, I had no idea what I wanted to do. My father was an unusual chap. He was a doctor, and his mantra was, Michael, whatever you want to do, I'm right behind you. That was the only advice he ever gave me in all my life. I could have done with a little extra, I think. But anyway, being thus confused, he had a huge library. And I can remember pulling down some books off that library on the Eastern spiritual tradition, yoga, meditation, enlightenment, the guru, the mantra, yoga. I thought, wow, this sounds engaging. But what particularly struck me was a rather extravagant claim that was made in these books for a life free of suffering, personal transformation, and an experience of the ultimate truth. And I thought, well, where do I sign? You know, I was wondering what I wanted to do, and this was for me, definitely. So I bought a motorcycle, I jumped on a ship, sailed to Sri Lanka, rode around Sri Lanka and up through India looking for a guru, right? Who'd come to me on strong recommendation. But as it turned out, the other motorcyclists I was travelling with, they were, oh, yeah, yoga or meditation, yeah, we don't want to do that. So I'd already been practicing yoga and meditation in Melbourne from the age of 18, and by this time I'm 22 years old. And I was an elastic man, I was a former gymnast, so yoga was very easy for me. But meditation had me completely stymied. If I was to meditate, I would sit down, and instead of becoming relaxed and peaceful, I'd get positively knotted up. So I thought, something's wrong here, I've got to get something handled. So it was my yoga teacher in Melbourne who said, go to India, there's a very great guru, he'll solve all your problems. Well, that was a good line. So I went there, but because my friends rather waylaid me, I kept going through Pakistan, Afghanistan, very interesting, Iran, Turkey, through Europe to London. In London, there was a little business I had tipped over and a girlfriend thing tipped over. So by this time, I was really ready to leave the world and devote myself to an almost monastic quest for God realization or enlightenment, if you like. So I flew to India to meet this guru who'd come on very good recommendation. I can remember arriving at his ashram, and an ashram is like a Hindu monastery where people do rigorous spiritual practices. And it turned out he wasn't there. I thought, oh my goodness, I've come a long way. I could barely pronounce his name as well. But luckily he was due to arrive in 3 or 4 days. And I was assembled at the front of this ashram with about 10 or 12 Indians. And there were 3 of us Westerners there, just 3. An Englishman, an Australian, and an American. Sounds like the beginning of a joke, right? Anyway, the next thing we knew, Muktananda, the guru, was coming to arrive. They'd sent word ahead on the telephone or something. And this 1962 blue Mercedes pulled up, the klaxon horn, and there it was coming over the horizon, drove up to the front of the ashram, and out jumped this very handsome 60-year-old man in flowing orange silk robes, Versace sunglasses. I thought, well, hello, stepped out of a Mercedes. He didn't look quite like a holy man, as I might have imagined, with a long white being saying, peace, my son, peace. Wasn't quite like that. He was dynamic, extraordinary. On first glimpse, he was quite remarkable. So he swept past this little gathering at the front who'd gone out to welcome him. All the Indians had prostrated flat on the ground as he approached, because the Indians regard the guru as higher than Catholics regard the Pope. He's the philosopher's stone, the one who brings transformation. And the freedom from bad reincarnation, all sorts of things like that. Anyway, so he just brushed past this group, lightly kicking them with his feet. And saying, look out, this is a fast train, this is a fast train. Someone translated that to me. So within about 2 or 3 minutes, this guy is really quite remarkable. So within about a week of being at this ashram, I had a chance to have a personal interview with him, and that was something of a privilege. It was translated by a professor from New Delhi, and I told him that I'd come all the way from Europe and before that Australia to have my meditation fixed. I wasn't a good meditator, and I'd come here for that very reason. And he said to me, through the translator, don't worry, everything will be fine. Good. So I think about another week passed, and then I found myself sitting in this meditation room on a real tiger skin paws, tiger skin head, and deer skins around the place. And these pictures going back from the 19th century, back to the 1800s and 1900s, with pictures of austere yogis going way back, meditators and this sort of thing. So it was a very unusual, a really wonderful atmosphere, actually. So I found myself sitting there one day, straining to meditate in my characteristic way, and all of a sudden, whoop, I was startled. And I looked up, and Muktananda was standing over me, the Guru. He took his hand and rubbed it across my forehead and over both cheeks like this, and turned on his heel and left. And I thought, whoa, I've been touched by the Guru. This was very auspicious. This was very special. This was the anointing. This was the touch. This was the initiation. And I was waiting for something to happen, and nothing happened. And I was a trifle disappointed, perhaps. But every day I'd meet him in the gardens as I walked around this beautiful ashram, mind you. Magnificent gardens with statues of Hindu gods in Play-Doh colours, and beautiful little walkways and streams and beautiful temples with marble floors, all this sort of thing. Anyway, I would bump into him in these gardens every day probably, and he would say to me in his very few words of English, good meditation, good meditation. And I'd say, we called him Baba, that means father. I'd say, no, Baba, no, nothing special. And then he'd ask me the second day, third day, and I started to get a trifle irritated. I thought, why are you asking me? You're the Guru, and the Guru is supposed to be omniscient and omnipotent, all-knowing, enlightened, and he's asking me. But about, again, one week, next week, I'm sitting there all alone one day, and all of a sudden, my body started to gyrate in a circular motion. I thought, hello, what's this? And I could stop it, and it began all of its own. It was altogether spontaneous. And I was quite fascinated. There was something going on, and I knew actually that in that system, the word for what had been awakened in me was the word Kundalini. And it has a bigger promise attached to it. So with each day as I sat there, that my body would start to stray in a more and more exaggerated motion. And I was able to stop it if I wanted. And as soon as I let go, it would begin again. Now, it was the beginning of it. I was fascinated. Finally, there was something happening. There was an engine that moved. It wasn't just a set of concepts and ideas and practices. There was really something going on. So then a Canadian turned up. This is a really multi-level. We've got an Australian, an American, Englishman, a Canadian. And he said, let's go and meditate, Michael. So it was the afternoon, and we went in and sat down together. And as we sat down, he said the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down on green pastures. He leads me by the still waters. He restores my soul. Blah, blah, blah. And that thing, I remember that from my schoolboy days. A little bit of chapel here and there. I thought, oh, how beautiful. And at that moment, I was moved by the beauty of that psalm. And all of a sudden, what had awakened me in 1 week before exploded into the power of 10 men. Now, I'm not given to exaggeration, but the strength of 10 men came over me. And I was flung to the floor. And I was agog, and I started to crawl my way across the floor, roaring like a lion. Excuse me, it sounds crazy, but I wasn't crazy. I was well possessed in my mind. I was fascinated and amazed. What on earth is this? I wasn't afraid because I was told that this was I didn't know what to expect, but anything that happened under the influence of this awakening or this initiation or this Kundalini was supposed to be constructive. So I didn't resist it, I just went with it. And then I was lifted to my feet, again with tremendous strength, and under the influence of this, we called it the Shakti as well, the energy of this thing. I was moved to the front of the meditation room door. By the way, the Canadian who was completely freaked out. He was going, good warm. I could hear him. I was aware of everything that was going on. He was trying to settle down the situation. Later, he told me that he had never seen anything, the nearest thing to an LSD freakout that he'd ever seen. This is the 60s, mind you. You know about all that stuff. I'd never taken LSD or anything. So I went to the front door of the meditation room. And the dogs, who were normally sullen mutts, they went down all foot and back. They were terrified. And I wasn't saying anything. Just the sight of me frightened them. It was amazing. But anyway, from that day, all sorts of spontaneous phenomena took place. I would rise to my feet, and my body would take all sorts of classical shape positions, dance positions, speaking in tongues sometimes. I'd see lights, there'd be moments of profound stillness and quietude, and then my body would assume all sorts of postures not dissimilar to yoga postures that people practice volitionally. Anyway, so I was amazed at the intelligence of this awakening. Now, it was a very rigorous daily routine there. We'd get up at 4:30 in the morning. We'd meditate for an hour. If you'd had this awakening, as I've just described, from the Guru's touch or his presence, then you would just allow that to do its work. It was supposed to be the intelligence of the inner self itself, and if you surrendered it to it over the fullness of time, it would expunge from you all the stultifying influences of the past, all what they would call karmic impressions that shut down awareness, and to finally bring you to the full appreciation and experience of the ultimate truth, or Parabrahman, or Nirvana, or Nirvana. They've got all sorts of names for it. So this was a very rigorous daily routine. We'd get up at 4 o'clock. If you had the awakening, then you let it manifest. If you didn't, and people went there in the hope to have this awakening or this touch, then they would be given a mantra, and they would sit there and repeat the mantra. The mantra that was given was called Soham, which means He, I am, which means virtually, I am God. So this was the idea, that to repeat this in such a way is that you would open yourself to this awakening that was possible for you through the touch of the Guru. And then there'd be 1.5 hours of chanting. In those days we would chant the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Hindu Bible, if you like. It means the Song of God, the Bhagavad Gita. And it's their most famous scripture. We would chant that for 1.5 hours in Sanskrit. So we had to sit there. We didn't have a clue what we were saying or doing. The discipline was you just did it. And then we'd go out there'd be a cup of tea. Then we'd go out into the fields and serve the Guru. It was called Guru Seva. It was called service to the Guru. Remember, the Guru was supposed to be enlightened. The Guru is supposed to be the means of realizing God. And a very important part of this whole pathway, which was called Siddha Yoga, S-I-D-D-H-A Yoga, it consisted of meditation, as I've described, the awakening as I've described. It consisted of having implacable faith in the Guru as being God realized and the means of realizing the truth. It involved devotional service and chanting, the Bhagavad Gita. So this went on. It was a daily routine. We'd be out in the gardens. Then before lunch there'd be a half-hour chant. Then lunch. Then after lunch there'd be another chant, and then a half-hour sleep or rest, if you like. And in the late afternoon yet another meditation and another chant, dinner and another chant. And there'd be 3 to 4 hours of chanting a day, about 1.5 hours of meditation a day, a lot of devotional service. 7 days a week we'd collapse into bed, and that was the end of that until the next day. So it was something like they would have experienced in a Benedictine monastery in the 11th century. But what really gripped me was this awakening. At that time I wasn't, it was all a bit too Hindu for me, too many statues with Play-Doh colours. I couldn't deal with a lot of the... I was more Christian enculturated, if you like. I would have preferred stained glass windows in the King James English than Sanskrit and Play-Doh colour gods and all that sort of stuff. But it was the awakening that gripped my attention. And I'd really gone there and hoped to have a change of heart and mind, to overcome my limitations, to become clear about my direction, and start to make measurable steps towards spiritual integration or spiritual life. But despite having these experiences, that wasn't happening. So finally I went back to Australia, and myself and 3 others, we invited Swami Muktananda to Australia. This was first venturing out of India. I was his first Australian devotee, and he actually came to Australia in 1970 with an entourage of about 4 or 5 people, including the famous Baba Ram Das, Richard Alpert, who your generation might not know about that, but Richard Alpert was the big Harvard professor who, along with Timothy Leary, was expelled from Harvard, and they became the great gurus of the drug culture of the 60s. They were the LSD top shots for advocates for that drug. Anyway, he's still very famous amongst people who are spiritual seekers in the West. I think he's died recently. This is Baba Ram Das or Richard Alpert. He came with Muktananda, and this was a great event. So Muktananda was later to become very famous in the West, along with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. You might have heard of him, the founder of TM, the guru of the Beatles. There was my guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Then there was Osho, who was the famous guru who owned 93 Rolls Royces of the Orange people fame in Oregon. Maybe you're all looking at blank. This is all big history. You're all a bit young for this, but this was international news in those days. And so I brought Muktananda to Australia, but I was always hopeful for a real change of heart and mind. I think that's the best way of describing it. I was aware of my limitations of temperament and character, this and that. I was a sort of a middle-class guy, a nice, basically honest fellow, but I knew there was more to life than money, food, sex, entertainment, and status and all that sort of stuff. So I was looking for it. But unfortunately, I wasn't finding it with my guru at that time. So as a consequence, I did a lot of the leading-edge personal development trainings of the day. What was later to become famous EST, Forum, Landmark Education, the Hoffman Quadrinity process, the Avatar training. And not only that, but I developed a training myself called the Decision Principle Training, which talks about decision being the first principle of existence. And God, if you like, or the infinite source, decided the universe into existence. We in turn decide, and we'll find that the decisions you've made, knowingly or unknowingly, have been the junction points of your life, wherever you move. Your decision to leave school at 15, your decision to marry John instead of Martha, or whatever it might be. So I taught that in Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, France, Switzerland, North America, Canada, and the United States. And I also taught meditation in Melbourne to a lot of doctors in the 80s and 90s. Now, over this period of time, I was going back and forth from India, still with my guru, still meditating every day, still holding to the Siddha Yoga system, the Eastern spiritual tradition out of India, reading broadly, experiencing deeply, and doing a lot of personal development programs. But then in the 1980s, I became a corporate consultant. And how that happened was this. I was an international tour manager. Now Muktananda, the one I just described, had died in 1982, but I became a tour manager for one of his successors. He handed the lineage on to a young man, who then became the guru, if you like, and I was his international tour manager. And while in upstate New York, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who'd won a huge corporate cultural change contract with Telecom Australia, $1.9 million. It was a lot of money in those days. He's a remarkable fellow. He knew me very well, and he knew that I'd had a strong interest in communication skills, and he said, we certainly need that as a part of our corporate cultural change program. So I came out to Australia, and with 6 others, we taught a broad range of personal and organisational development strategies to Telecom Australia. They had 95,000 employees in those days. We taught them communication skills, think tanking, belief engineering, customer orientation, goal setting, think tank, all this sort of thing. And this went on for quite a number of years in the 80s. So by now, I'd had a really deep experiential penetration of the old age movement out of India, the new age personal development programs under the umbrella, if you like, we might call it the human potential movement, and also the practical and pragmatic world of corporate consulting. So let me put it this way, I'd really gone around the block to find out what was possible, what could really make a difference to my life. Now I enjoyed all that, I found it engaging. I was in it, but not quite of it. Nothing really landed with me so well. There was always something missing. But there was one thing I'd never done. I'd never gone into retreat. So I'd read a lot of the mystics, from the Islamic tradition, the Christian tradition, the Buddhist, Hindu traditions. Some of these people had walled themselves up for 20 years. Some of them had gone into the desert and spoken to no one for many years. Others had gone into retreat here, there and everywhere in different ways and different modes. But this I'd never done. So I decided to go into retreat for 10 days at the back of a house here I have in Melbourne with a little flat there, and had a friend put barricades on the windows, close up the door with a panel. I was a little afraid that if I went in there for 10 days, after 3 days, I might say, I don't want to do this anymore, and leave. Well, I thought, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I've got to be sure that I'm going to stay in there for 10 days and do what I undertook to do. As it turned out, it was really easy. But what happened on one of these days was quite extraordinary. And it's very important to say this because at the time I was in a completely plain state of mind as I am talking to you right now. No meditation, nothing, no entrancement. And I was simply getting ready to settle myself onto a chair, and all of a sudden the image of Jesus Christ formed up inside my chest cavity. And with the image came the conviction of who it was, and within 1 second of that there was an experience beyond all words can tell. And if I was to step it down into the poverty of language, there was an openness and love coming from Christ to me of cosmic proportions, and an invitation and a welcome as if to say, give me your life and breath and I'll take care of you. Well, I was amazed. I was delighted. I was agog. I thought, this is incredible. It was as real as you're sitting there. Now, but I didn't know how to respond. Jesus, it was fine. Jesus, Christianity, I'm cool, I'm a yogi, I'm doing the real thing, I'm in the Eastern tradition. I read a lot about Christian mysticism. I loved some of those Christian saints of the 15th and 16th century from the monasteries like St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, Miguel de Molinos, Meister Eckhart. They were very cool. But Jesus was always a little bit of a flat line for me. But here, he showed up in this dramatic and amazing way. And I would never have given attention to Christ if I hadn't had such an impactful experience. But I just kept doing precisely what I was doing because I didn't know how to respond. At the time, I was meditating for, not meditating all that time, but every morning for 2 hours I'd get up, I'd do 25 minutes of formal meditation, then another half hour of giving over to the awakening that I described, that I received in India. And then I'd chant another chant in those days called the Guru Gita. 2 hours of practice every day, and I continued. But then 1 year passed, and I flew to America to do an introductory program on a training I'd developed called the Decision Principle, and also Veritas and a few other things that I had developed that I wanted to share with people. And during that time in Berkeley, California, an extraordinary thing happened. Over a 3-day period, as if pushed into me from outside myself, which is strange, came the conviction that everything I had done, the thousands of hours of meditation, of cognitions, this interesting spiritual experience I'd had in the Eastern tradition, had all added up to a huge fat zero. It was really sobering. It wasn't an awful experience. I just thought, wow, this is amazing. It was as though I, like a man who'd been digging for gold for years, had a barrel full of it, took it to the bank to cash it in, and the cashier said, I'm sorry, this is just iron pyrites. Phil's gold, it's not worth anything. I don't mean to be demeaning about anything, because I did have a lot of interesting experiences, but with respect to what I was looking for, the change of heart and mind, as I describe it best, it had eluded me. And not only myself, but I'd walked shoulder to shoulder with thousands of people over 28 years. I was an ashram manager in India, 2,000 people were there. Well, I'm just dealing with people all the time. So I knew well the fruit of what was expected, what was hoped for, and what was actually realised in the lives of people. And as it was with me, so similarly it was with some others, because even though they were nice people, they were good friends of mine, I really couldn't see in them what the Guru had promised. And I certainly hadn't found it within myself. So after that, then I couldn't help remembering that a remarkable encounter with Jesus Christ 1 year earlier. Now, I was driving between Berkeley and San Francisco every day in my car. I kept catching on the radio, I kept catching these evangelical preachers preaching from the Bible. Now, I'd never heard this before. And I can remember thinking, well, they're good talkers, you know. I thought that, you know, they speak very well. And I was open. I mean, I'd always listen to anything. You know, I'd like to know more about Islam, about Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, wherever I could get it. So I listened, and I became more and more intrigued. I started to see some similarities between the Eastern spiritual tradition that I'd been so attached to and the biblical revelation. But then it was the differences that caught my attention, significant differences. So I was so enamored of listening to these guys that I sent away I'd listen every day for an hour and a half on my two-way journey. Then I'd send away for the tapes that they'd advertise. You know, they'd say, "Oh, this is one part of the set of 6," and I'd ring out and I'd sit there on my bed and listen to the tapes. And maybe 150 hours passed, and I'd listened to so much without any contact with any Christians at all. But I became familiar with the first principles of Christianity. I became quite well educated listening to these very fine teachers. I grew to know who Christ was, why he came, who he claimed to be. That was pretty extraordinary. I'm the Alpha, the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Come to me, all those are heavily laden, and I will give you rest. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And what he'd accomplished on the cross, that was a little bit confusing to me. But having taken everything that separates us from God upon himself, our sin debt, our karmic debt, I thought, wow. So I'd so exhaustively, in such a disciplined manner, explored so broadly and deeply, and it hadn't borne fruit, that I started to get excited about, well, I'm going to tip in with Jesus Christ. It was a bit spooky for me. It sounded a little bit religious, because I was cool, remember. Now this was the Bible, Jesus. But I saw a big sign, I think it was Oakland, California. I saw Billy Graham coming to town. Now, I didn't say that, but I knew about Billy Graham. Everyone in my generation knew about Billy Graham, no matter who they were. He had about 80,000 people in the MCG in 1957 or something like that. And I knew one thing about Billy Graham, and that is he invited people to decide for Christ. And this was absolutely my thing, the decision principle. I was the master of this, if you like. So I decided, yes, what a wonderful opportunity to make a marker, a great event of this decision that I can make in front of, as it turned out, 22,000 witnesses. So I went along to this Billy Graham thing at a huge stadium, whatever it was called, in 1997 for that one purpose, to decide for Christ. I'd made up my mind. So I went there. I was there very early. because I didn't want to lose my way. See, we didn't have GPS in those days. And I didn't know where I was going. I got there about an hour early. And as I was walking to the big stadium, there was a homeless guy sitting on the side of the street. And as I walked by, he said, "Have you got a fag? You know, got a cigarette?" Oh, I said, no, sorry, I don't. No. But 4 doors up, there was a big tobacconist, right? So I walked in, I bought a whole carton of cigarettes. And I walked back 100 metres, and I gave him the carton, and I sat there and just watched him. He opened the carton, took out a packet of cigarettes. He took out one cigarette and put it in his mouth and handed the carton back to me, right? And I said, "No, the whole carton's for you." He said, "Brah!" He couldn't believe it. Well, that was my first Christian charitable act. And I hadn't even become a Christian yet, right? It was a funny thing. So I went on. I went up to the big stand there, and I waited for another hour while 22,000 people assembled. And when Billy Graham invited people to make the decision for Christ, I shot down like a shot out of a gun. I was down there, so close, standing up on a podium, I could almost reach up and polish his shoes. When he actually invited people to decide for Christ, I made that decision clearly, certainly, no falling back. That was it. I'd made that decision. And from that moment, I was never quite the same again. It was silent. It was undramatic. It wasn't a charismatic thing at all. But somehow I knew that strange thing, that born again thing they talked about. Maybe, wow, something's overcome me. I'm not sure what it is. And a rest came over me. That's a better word than peace, if you like. Something had changed. There was a rest within me. Something had been resolved. And above all, what began on that day was a change of heart and mind that I'd reached for all these years through my disciplines and practices, through the thousands of hours of meditation, the trainings I'd undergone, the trainings I'd taught. And it was all coming as a free gift of grace, independent of my own practice, which is extraordinary. Now that change was not dramatic, but it was measurable. I thought, whoa, this is good, things are changing. It was a free gift of grace, as Christianity speaks about, as the gift of Christ and gift of the Holy Spirit. And my son noticed it, my friends noticed it, they still smile today. When we converse, when I go back to America and talk to them, "Oh, we remember, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you did change, you know." So it was altogether remarkable. So that began a whole new life, if you like. And I might even say that I could consider myself the most surprised convert in Christendom, if you like. I could never have expected in 1,000 years that I would have turned to Christ. That in doing so, His grace came over me, something for which I was enormously grateful. So I then started reading the Bible. I started mixing with Christians with whom I had nothing in common except the gospel. Nothing. Who are these people? I used to look around. But I had the understanding that had come over me that the Bible was an inspired word, that there was something interesting about that book. I kept reading it. Some of it was a bit difficult, but it had a certain quality and texture to it that no other book I'd ever read had. It was almost like sweet milk to me, you know. There was something coming from it or in relation to it. I started mixing with Christians. I started going to church and being sort of intellectually put together in a way to probe all the doctrine and theology that perhaps a lot of people are not so interested in. I went into that assiduously, and I was staggered by the breadth and depth of this Christian world. I was amazed. So it was altogether a new life, a new path, for which I was very grateful. And what I finally discovered, as the Bible says, that in Him, in Christ, are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And He said an interesting thing. Jesus Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He didn't say, "I'll tell you the way. I'll add life to you. I will show you the truth." He said, "I am the living embodiment of that." So it was in the recognition of Jesus Christ being alive and active in the lives of people today, as I can attest from my own experience and the experience of others, that really cleave me to him in complete faith, trust and hope. And in that conviction, in that belief, I've found something extraordinary, and I've found rest, for which I'm tremendously grateful. So that's the story. Interesting. So thank you for listening. So what we'll do after all that, we'll do a mindfulness and a short meditation. I think we can enjoy that together. And then afterwards we can relax and have a cup of tea and have a